America a capture, the whole of Jamaica a capture. A long time them want trick the Rasta man, like them no know said that man a real African. You think me no member King Ferdinand, and thief in Columbus got a golden plan. They make a wrong turn and end up in Caribbean. Wanna Ross genocide them kill enough Indian, and then turn paradise in a plantation and bring cross enough shipload of African. Then here comes street thieving queen from England, and the kings no sheep from Well and Henry Morgan. Century pot up a century full as of operation. 400 years without a reparation. Now they want me kill me with taxation, and I'm gonna beg you please them to the motherland. Carry me go.
This is the Lest We Forget podcast, a historical podcast by Tenement Yard Media. I'm Gabrielle, your host for this episode, and today we'll be taking a look at the 1859 toll riots of Jamaica.
What you want and what you will, working for your dollar bill. Sad to see the old slave mill is grinding slow but grinding still. And walking home a child gets killed, neighbors free to shoot at will. Sad to see that old slave mill is grinding slow but grinding still. And 9 to 5, you know the drill, weekends are a short-lived thrill. Sad to see that old slave mill is grinding slow but grinding still.
Opening lines from Damian Jr. Gong Marley's 2017 song Slave Mill. It describes what happened following the events of August 1, 1838. On that day, Jamaica, alongside the rest of the countries in the British West Indies, achieved emancipation, and all enslaved black people on the island gained their freedom. Very soon after, like immediately, the topic of land became a major issue. See, uncultivated land in Jamaica and the rest of those in the British colonies really was divided into two categories: Crown land and backland. Crown land was undistributed land that was still owned by England but not suitable for settlements as they were located in mountainous forested areas. Backlands, on the other hand, were largely uncultivated estate lands. Still, neither of these lands were accessible for the formerly enslaved, for even though Freedom Day came for all black persons, white planter landowners bound the formerly enslaved population with long labor contracts and labor rent tenants contracts. This meant that they forced the freed population to work on these lands by charging very pricey rents on estate-based houses to anyone who was not an employee. They even made it very difficult for black people to produce cash crops, and this drove thousands of freed blacks right back to the plantation they were once freed from. Some of the formerly enslaved tried to purchase land, but according to historian Woodville Marshall in his paper, Aspects of the Development of the Peasantry, an estimated 815,000 acres of land were in arrears of payment of quit rent and other taxes. Then between 1871 and 1912, nearly 250,000 acres became property of the Crown for the non-payment of taxes. It also did not help that these freed persons who worked on plantations to afford their own land were given extremely low wages. So in the true nature of being oppressed, some members of the newly freed black population decided they were going to settle on Jamaican lands by any means possible, and thus squatting became the only option of many to avoid planters' exploitation. Through these means, free villages were established, many of which still exist as communities today, but they still had a fight. The state passed legislation against squatting, and it was not until 1895 that Jamaica and any other territory really revised this policy. The situation didn't even get any better when indentured servants, that is, Indians, Chinese, and other nationalities, were brought to the island to support the still dominant sugar economy. In 1897, a royal commission found evidence of the desperate need of land ownership by oppressed groups. This was termed land hunger. A section of the report states, quote, "Both the Negro and Coolie like to own small patches of land by which they make their livelihood and take a pride in their position as landowners." End quote. Then there were the other issues. The state's complete neglect of the peasantry class. The peasantry class was created right after emancipation and was categorized by formerly enslaved people who started small farms surrounding plantations, or really where they could find unoccupied land. After emancipation, the government provided little to no improvement of properties. No roads were built or the maintenance of existing roads improved in peasant districts. Services such as markets, hospitals, and schools were rarely established, nor were any policies to improve peasant agriculture implemented. Then the white planters orchestrated a whole propaganda plan against the peasantry by labeling them as just squatters, having a love of uncivilized ease, prone to relapse into barbarism and the savage state, and being too lazy to work on the sugar plantations. They were successful as legislation was passed against the peasantry, which saw many having to resort to going back to live on estates. One of the main legislation was the implementation of heavy taxes. Taxes were placed on peasants' houses and their livestock. An example of this is seen in Grenada and Tobago, where planters' animals were either lightly taxed or not taxed at all, while those of the peasantry were very heavily taxed. Still, it was the land tax that burdened many of the peasantry class. For example, in St. Vincent, a tax was established in 1844 upon all farmers who did not produce taxable goods. In Tobago, a land tax was levied in 1843 on land not directly attached to an estate or leased to small owners. A stipendiary magistrate in Tobago described these taxes as, quote, either robbery or confiscation. In March of 1849, a protest against these land taxes broke out in St. Lucia. First, petitions were sent to the governor, where black peasants expressed their concerns over the newly imposed land taxes. They said that low cost of produce and the already high rent created an unbearable reality to pay such high land tax. They wanted the tax to be repealed so they'd have the chance to make an honest living. But it seems the government did not take their concerns seriously, and subsequently a protest and a demonstration unfolded near the government main office. Ultimately, this demonstration led to a bloody riot with a death toll of 8 and damage done to numerous sugar estates as a result of fire. However, the governor stated that the riot was orchestrated by persons from Martinique who were aligned with communist and republican principles and wanted to see the government's strength and firmness. Back in Jamaica, it wasn't just the land tax that was causing issues, but the introduction of toll gates. Toll roads were really nothing new in Jamaica. White planters placed gates across roads passing through their lands to secure property and to monitor movement. In the book Jamaican Place Names by B.W. Higman and B.J. Hudson, the authors state that from the 1740s to the 1860s, a network of turnpikes operated in the country with toll gates along for the collection of payments. However, in the years following emancipation, these monies collected at the toll did not go into the maintenance of roads for the peasants, but were only used to serve the interest of white planters and white landowners. And I should repeat what I said previously. After emancipation, the government provided little to no improvement of the property. No roads were built or the maintenance of existing roads improved in peasant districts. Services such as markets, hospitals, and schools were rarely established, nor were any policies to improve peasant agriculture implemented. However, in the mid-1800s, the issue of land and toll gates and the subsequent riots and protests that took place were not only occurring in the Caribbean, but across the British colonies. In Wales, in particular, a series of protests between the years of 1839 to 1843 demonstrated the frustration of peasants and small farming communities with taxes imposed on them. These riots are known today as the Rebecca riots. At the beginning of the 1800s, many of the main roads in Wales were owned and operated by turnpike trusts. These trusts were established to maintain and improve the condition of the roads and bridges by charging travelers tolls to use them. But what was really happening was that the trusts were overseen by English businessmen who used this power to exploit money out of the locals. The people that suffered the most were the rural farming folks of Wales. Already in the early decades of the century, this population of the area faced hardships due to horrible harvests and the mandatory tithe they had to pay to the church. In the late 1830s, they were told that they would have to pay to take their animals and crops to market and bring fertilizer back for the fields. This further threatened the rural population's livelihood and formed the catalyst of the Rebecca riots, where the rural population demonstrated their frustration over the tolls. The earliest signs of the riots occurred in 1839, right after a new toll gate was established in Falmouth to catch farmers who did not pay tolls elsewhere. In one market town, Carmarthen, there were already 12 toll gates around it. Soon after the toll gate was established in Falmouth, there was an attack on a new workhouse at Narberth, and gangs were formed soon after to attack the toll gates. The members of these gangs wore women's clothes and blackened their faces in disguise. The name of these toll gates? Rebecca and her daughters. The most accepted theory behind this name is biblical. In those days, Welsh residents had to learn to read a particular scripture which speaks of a woman named Rebecca, found in Genesis 24 verse 60. It reads thus: "And they blessed Rebekah, and said unto her, Thou art our sister, by thou the mother of thousands of millions, and let thy seed possess the gate of those that hate them." As interpreted by the residents, that scripture spoke to their need to destroy the toll gates. By 1842 to 1843, the economy was in further decline, and the rural population's frustration over the toll and other monetary increases boiled over. Rioting broke out across Wales, and it so happened, by the time the Rebecca and her daughters gang were done voicing their frustration, every single toll gate in the area was attacked. Not one was left standing. And their frustration did not stop at the tolls. Landlords were also threatened to lower their rents, and persons who were seen as exploiting the population were also attacked. During the attacks, persons were reported to have shouted, "I am averse to tyranny and oppression." Nevertheless, by late 1843, the government increased the presence of troops in the area, and eventually the rioting came to an end. But Rebecca and her daughters were successful, as the toll gates were removed from the roads in the area, and it stayed that way for almost 100 years. The next toll gate to be established in the area after the riots was in 1966. So in February of 1859, when the black peasantry of western Jamaica, who were already burdened with numerous taxes imposed on them, got fed up with the toll gates that were placed on roads leading to Savannah Lamar, the events that followed mirrored the Welsh Rebecca riots that took place almost 20 years prior. So far, I've explained how the 1830s and 1840s, the years following the British emancipation, the formerly enslaved, although now off the plantations, realized that the system trapped them and emancipation was not materializing in the way it should be. Any means of freedom for them, especially the means to own land and have businesses, were curtailed in exploitative taxation. But then in the midst of all this, in 1851, a Board of Commission of Highways and Bridges was established. The purpose of the commission was to oversee the operation of toll gates on the island. And if black people in the country thought they had enough of tax and toll gates, it was only going to get worse. Throughout the 1850s, the location of toll gates became even more burdensome, and at some locations, ridiculous. Former librarian and secretary at the Institute of Jamaica, Frank Kundal, in his book Political and Social Disturbance in the West Indies, says that, quote, one ill effect of the Jamaica toll gate law was that in some cases, toll had to be paid in order to fetch water, end quote. On February 12, 1859, residents of Westmoreland, a western parish of Jamaica, had enough. Inspired by Rebecca and her daughters, some persons dressed in women's clothing joined others to demonstrate their grievance with the state. Fueled by their frustration, they took to the streets and destroyed toll keepers and the toll gates throughout Savannah-Lamar and other towns in Westmoreland. Law officers were sent in to curb the rioting, but they were ineffective reinforcement from neighboring western parishes of Trelawney, Hanover, St. James, and St. Elizabeth. On March 4, the Falmouth Post wrote the following on what occurred, and I'll now give you a dramatic reading. The demolition of toll gates in the parish of Westmoreland, the pulling down of toll keepers' houses, and the threats held out to persons in authority by a lawless, desperate rabble are events which have resulted from mischievous speeches delivered at public meetings and from editorial articles, especially mischievous, which have approved from time to time in the columns of newspapers owned by persons who are always boasting of their patriotism and friendship for the people. The late riots were planned by men of tolerable intelligence. Some who aspire to the rank of respectable citizenship counseled that the law should be set at defiance, and salaried officers have taken, if not a direct, at all events an indirect part in the disturbances. Not too sure what that accent was actually, but we continue. Another of the country's newspaper editors wrote the following in relation to the Westmoreland riots of 1859. This time I'll hold the accent. The peasantry are well disposed, and if left to themselves would respect the authorities and obey the laws of the land. But their minds are influenced by political quacks who are indifferent to the probable results of reckless agitation. When the persons who took part in the riots of 1859 were arrested, a special commission was set up to put them on trial. However, when the trial began on March 9th, a crowd of around 2,000 persons showed up. Soon after, the governor himself, Charles Henry Darling, went down to Westmoreland with a large military force. Then the custos of the area was replaced, but the state did not take into account the almost 2 decades of exploitation clouded in tax and tolls that the black population had been subjected to, and no change in legislation around land. So 5 months after the Westmoreland riots, there was another disturbance in the neighboring parish of Trelawney. And yes, this was also associated with land. The whole incident stemmed from the arrest of a man of mixed race, Theodore Buey, who was evicted from the Florence Hall estate where he lived. Buey was arrested along with a number of his supporters. A special commission was set up to try them. So on August 1st, 1859, exactly 21 years after emancipation in Jamaica and the rest of the British West Indies, when the trial started, persons sympathetic to the case of Buey intervened. A large crowd made up of women and men showed up with stones and bottles and attacked the Falmouth police officers who were escorting the arrested persons to the court. This resulted in the arrested being released, the police injured, and the courthouse, police stations, and other buildings around Falmouth receiving damage. Against these stones and bottles, the police officers drew their guns and fired, killing 3 women and wounding others. Extra police officers were called in from the parishes of St. James and Hanover, which led to the West India Regiment being sent from Kingston, and over 100 persons were arrested. I should note, the West India Regiment was the infantry unit of the British Army, recruited from and normally stationed in the British colonies of the Caribbean between 1795 and 1927. In their article of the events, the Falmouth Post linked the event to the Westmoreland riots, and the 3 women who were murdered by the police, a verdict ruled justifiable homicide. Despite the 2 riots that took place in 1859, the peasants and their calls for legislative change towards the numerous taxes they were subjected to, and having the ability to get access to land and to buy said land, was ignored. By the early 1860s, the situation became even harder. The U.S. Civil War affected the sugar industry, which curtailed many economies in the British colonies, including Jamaica. On the island in 1865, there was a terrible drought which created even more hardship, and the black population was already facing low wages and burdensome taxation. So the peasants wrote petitions where they complained about the government's neglect. They stressed the awful condition of the roads in their districts and the destruction of their crops by white planters grazing herds of cattle which they could not fence out. But most importantly, they complained about the shortage of land for cultivation and the racial bias they faced as black people in the legal courts of Jamaica, particularly in cases involving the titling of land, securing land, and their rights to tenancy. The government did not listen to them. So one group of peasants from St. Anne took it a step further. They wrote to the Queen of England, Queen Victoria. Here they also included in their pleas relief from the gruesome taxes and tolls, an improvement in the administration of justice, and for them to have a fair and just ability to access the backlands and crown lands of Jamaica. Their April 25, 1865 letter to the British monarch speaks of their need for a great want at this moment from the bad state of our island. It so happens that the Queen responded in a reply which the state distributed. They called it the Queen's Advice. In her response to the black population in the country, she stated that workers' prosperity depended upon them working harder to make the plantations productive, and by them working harder, that's how they can make better wages. In summary, she said, "Work harder, you peasants." Pushed to the brink of their frustration, the peasants organized themselves just like the Westmoreland riots of 1859. However, unlike 1859, in 1865, there was a political consciousness in the peasants' organization. Here, they had an allyship in a local colored politician on the island, George William Gordon, who occasionally championed their cause in the House Assembly. Another difference was that in 1865, the peasants found a leader in a native Baptist preacher who possessed a strong ability to organize. His name, Paul Bogle. So in October 1865, a few months after the peasants were told to just work harder by the Queen, Paul Bogle led a protest against the court settlement of a land dispute in the eastern parish of St. Thomas. See, It's always about land, But the protest resulted in Bogle and others being placed on state watch to be arrested. On October 11, 1865, Bogle led a march to the Morant Bay courthouse. What happened is probably one of the most important events that took place in the British West Indies in the 19th century, the Morant Bay Rebellion. Excluding this rebellion between 1838 and 1905, there were 20 other disturbances that took place in the British West Indies, 5 in Guyana and 4 in Trinidad and Tobago, 2 in Dominica, and 1 each in Barbados, St. Kitts, Montserrat, and Belize. None of these matched even half the scope, coverage, and resulting litigation like that of the Morant Bay Rebellion, a rebellion which stemmed from the issues of land and, more broadly, the promises of freedom which black people in the British West Indies found they were not privy to. In his paper From Slave Rebellions to Morant Bay, The Tradition of Protests in Jamaica, historian Dr. Gad Human states, quote, "The riots of 1859 highlighted some of the issues which profoundly affected post-emancipation Jamaica and would prove crucial 6 years later at Morant Bay. High taxes, the cause of the first riot in 1859, whether in the form of assessments or of toll gates, were a serious problem for the mass of the people, especially as the legislature had shifted a heavy proportion of the taxes onto the ex-slaves and away from the plantocracy. The lack of justice, which was an important element in the Buick case, was one of the leading factors in the outbreak at Morant Bay." End quote. Decades have passed since the Westmoreland riots of 1859 and the Morant Bay Rebellion and the other disturbances that took place across the region. But still, legislation against black peasants owning and having access to the land and the gruesome taxation laws they were subjected to were ignored and, in some countries, built upon. Almost a century after the riots, black peasants who were members of Rastafari would be embroiled with white landowners and the state over land accessibility in western Jamaica, a dispute which ultimately culminated with the 1963 Coral Gardens Massacre. The effects of this history of land in the region are still seen today. Even though different nations have put measures in place to get to the root of land ownership, an issue lies in who has access to the land, who has owned the land, the change of the ownership of this land throughout centuries, but most importantly, who has been given the ability, resources, and opportunities to have access to land. Even though other groups of persons have traveled to the region in large numbers after emancipation, the Chinese, Indians, Lebanese, and so on, and have owned lands, the decades of legislation, taxation, neglect, and prejudice blocking black persons from land access and ownership across the Caribbean still affects that group today. Today, across the region, black persons who have had generations of their family living on the lands, in some countries those of Indian heritage, are deemed as squatters with ineffective legislation put in place for them to have legal ownership for this land. But then on the flip side, in some Caribbean countries, the owners of large areas of land, of towns even, can trace their family lineage to plantation owners in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. This history also gives context to societal views of where black people are allowed to take up space, literally. One can look at the lives of two of the most famous Jamaicans. The hostility that Bob Marley faced by white Jamaicans while living in an upper-class neighborhood on Hope Road in the 1970s, and in recent years, Usain Bolt and his experiences as a resident in an upper-class neighborhood in the Kingston and St. Andrew area. But the craziest thing is, the concept of backlands and crown lands still exists today. As such, the head monarch of England, where at the time of this recording is Queen Elizabeth II, owns all public land in Jamaica. Actually, no. The English monarch, the royal family of England, owns all of the public land in every Caribbean country where they are the head of state. The person occupying that land only has a tenure. Legally, no one but the crown owns the land. They only own interest in the land. So you know what? Jamaican musician Chronix, in his 2014 single Capture Land, was right. We are all really living on capture land.